for those of you who are joining us this morning. We always talk casually for a little bit while we're welcoming you into our space. So officially welcome to the Clements Library Bookworm. This is our 63rd episode of the Bookworm, and I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library. Today's meeting will be recorded to share online later, and so as someone who signed up for the program, you'll receive an email with the resources mentioned during today's broadcast, along with a link to that recording. Just in case you're joining us for the first time, I want to mention how we use Zoom. We will use the chat throughout the program. My colleagues Anne Bennington-Helber and Helen Harding will be monitoring the chat and pasting helpful links in there. But we also encourage you to chime in and change the setting to everyone so that everyone can see what you're writing. If you have questions for our panelists today, please put those in the Q&A section. That way it keeps them in one place, and also everyone can see the questions that are being asked. And if it's something that you were about to ask, just give it a thumbs up, and that reorders the questions in order of interest. We have the live machine captions turned on today as part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion program. So you can toggle those on or off, and you can change the size. So please play around with that. And speaking of which, I can only control so much of what you see. So we do have side-by-side mode enabled. So feel free to move that separator bar to create the best experience possible for you. Okay, and this program is brought to you by the Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of history and culture of North America and the Caribbean to about 1900. I would also like to take a moment as a descendant of the Saginaw Chippewa tribe to give a sense of place and to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. And in 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. We have a poll that we always put up at the beginning of this program, just, to get some sense for what the audience is thinking about our program today. So if you haven't clicked on it yet, you have 2 seconds to do so. And I'm going to end the poll and share the results. And so we were curious to know how many people had heard about the Grimke family and how long ago that might have been. And so this is really interesting to see that over 50% of you, this is sort of your first introduction to the Grimke family. And so I think that's really interesting. And we thank you for being here, and hope that you'll continue to explore all sorts of names in history that you might not have heard of before. and that we hope we can help you with that as well. Today's episode is generously sponsored by Cinda Sue Davis. So thank you so much for your sponsorship and your participation in the Bookworm program. We really appreciate it. I'm delighted to welcome both Kerri Greenidge and Martha Jones to the program today. And Martha is joining us from Berlin, where she is on a research, research leave from Johns Hopkins University, where she is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and Professor at the SNF Agora Institute. Martha also directs the Hard Histories at Hopkins project since 2020, where she's been examining the role of slavery and racism at the Johns Hopkins University and Hospital. Much to our delight, she also makes time to serve on the Clements Library Associates Board of Governors. And so, Martha, I'm so happy to turn this program over to you for introduction and discussion, and please take it away.
Well, welcome everybody. Thanks very much to you, Angela, and also to Helen and Anne, who I know are behind the scenes in the chat. And it's been a real team effort, as I think all of us are somewhere where the cold and the snow are wreaking havoc on internet connections, among other things. So appreciate especially everybody chipping in to make sure that we can be together today. And thanks to everybody who's come out. It's my true honor to introduce to you Kerri Greenidge. I will, Dr. Greenidge, offer, of course, your very important bio, but I just have to say personally, you know, you are a historian whose work I so greatly admire. This has been a real pleasure for me to read again this book. I think it's probably my third read, but you know, you and I in many ways have worked alongside each other, and so I really appreciate this chance to ask you some questions. But let me begin with an introduction for those of you who don't already know Dr. Greenidge. She is the Mellon Associate Professor in the Department of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora at Tufts University, where she also co-directs the African American Trail Project. She's the author of Black Radical: The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter, published in 2019. That book was listed by the New York Times as one of its top picks of 2019. The book is the first biography of Boston editor William Monroe Trotter, written in nearly 50 years. The book received the Mark Linton Prize in History, the Massachusetts Book Award, the J. Anthony Lucas Award, the Sperber Award from Fordham University, and the Peter J. Gomes Book Prize from the Massachusetts Historical Society. Black Radical was also shortlisted for the Stone Book Award from the Museum of African American History in Boston, the Kundal History Prize, and the Plutarch Award for Best Biography. Not to be surpassed, but really the Grimkes is appeared with all the promise and all the distinction that your first book received. The Grimkes, The Legacy of Slavery in an American Family, that we'll be talking about today, was recently listed as a best book of the year by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Boston Globe, among other publications. It was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Los Angeles Times Book Award, in addition to the J. Anthony Lucas Award. Professor Greenidge's writings have appeared in the Massachusetts Historical Review, the Radical History Review, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Guardian. Welcome to the Clements Library, Dr. Greenidge.
Thank you so much for having me. And I will, before I begin, I will just say, I've said it privately, but it's always a pleasure as I, embark on my historical career to be in conversation with someone who has inspired my own work, Martha Jones, and the way I approach my work. So thank you so much. As a history nerd, I am always like fangirling. So anyway, thank you so much. And thank you to the Clements Library, to Angela and to Helen and to Anne and to everyone who made this possible, but particularly to the Clements Library generally. I was writing this book during the pandemic, and so I would contact Clements, and their research staff would scan for me very generously the stuff that I needed. So thank you so much to the Clements. I appreciate you. So I'm going to approach talking about the Grimkés a little differently today by talking about one of the members of their family that tends to get the least attention. And then I will open it up for questions. So if we can go to the first slide. All right. In our current political moment, as we too often experience America's complex racial history in trendy hashtags and milquetoast op-eds, Charlotte Forten Grimke, seen here, has become an unfortunate victim of pop culture memification. Although nothing in Forten Grimke's life indicates that she would have countenanced the hashtag Black Girl Magic or embraced the obtuse notion of Shiro foremother, her image has often littered social media as a symbol of Black womanhood. Her writings reduced, like so many of her contemporaries, to non-contextual misquotes and 16-character homage. In this vein, her famous diaries have been condensed into at least one children's book, Diary of Charlotte Forten Grimke, A Free Black Girl Before the Civil War, which came out in 2014, and anthologized in various volumes of radical women's history. The edited 2-volume, for instance, Radicals, Audacious Writings by American Women, which came out in 2021. Such reductive accounts of Forten Grimke's life are often so two-dimensional that younger scholars can almost be forgiven for missing the early canonical analyses of Forten Grimke's work by Brenda Stevenson, Jean Fagan-Yellen, and Ray Billington, among others. Stevenson, of course, edited the most cited collection of Forten Grimke's diaries, published by Oxford in 1988, while Yellen's prize-winning biography of Forten Grimke kin, Harriet Jacobs, provides one of the most significant studies of the Edenton, North Carolina slaveholding society in which Forten Grimke's mother was born. A third-generation Philadelphia abolitionist, the granddaughter of James Forten, and the wife of postbellum Presbyterian minister Francis James Grimke, Charlotte Forten Grimke's achievements seem custom-made for our Black Girl Magic obsession in 2024. The first Black woman to graduate from a predominantly white college in Salem, Massachusetts, she was also the first Black woman published in the prestigious Atlantic Monthly, and one of a handful of Black women teachers who volunteered to teach freed people in the Sea Islands during the final years of the Civil War. When she married the young Princeton Theological Seminary graduate Francis James Grimke in 1878, when she was over 40 and he was not yet 28, Charlotte Forten Grimke sealed her seat at the exclusive table of a postbellum pre-Harlem quote-unquote colored elite that nurtured the political and cultural ascent of post-Reconstruction era Black women thinkers like Mary Church Terrell, Josephine Bruce, and Forten Grimke's closest friend, Anna Julia Cooper. Yet to reduce Forten Grimke's life to a series of achievements without contextualizing her lifelong encounters with persistent, sometimes violent white resentment risks reducing her and her famous family to a congratulatory story of racial exceptionalism. This has, of course, been the error of early historians, who have studied Charlotte Forten Grimke as either a footnote or as an adjunct to the antebellum white anti-slavery and women's rights movements in which she participated. Gerda Lerner, the famous feminist historian, mentions Charlotte Forten twice in her seminal study, The Grimke Sisters from South Carolina. And in spite of the brilliant scholarship of Black women scholars and scholars of color, including Shirley Yee, Carla Peterson, Erica Dunbar, Amrita Chakrabarti Myers, to name only a few, Charlotte Forten Grimke has only recently been taken seriously as an abolitionist intellectual in her own right. I argue, however, that to truly understand the intricacies of abolitionist feminists, in the early American Republic, we must place Black women at the center of our historical analysis. In fact, I would argue that more than any other member of the Grimke family, Charlotte Forten Grimke illustrates the liabilities and limitations of white women's antebellum anti-slavery. From her birth in 1837 until her arrival in Salem in 1853, Charlotte Forten's early life, and indeed her earliest politicization, was shaped by the personal, institutional, and cultural consequences of white reform women's racial condescension and often resentful interactions with Black women. Her paternal aunts, Harriet Forten Purvis, Sarah Forten Purvis, and Margaretta Forten, were founders of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society in 1834, before the inability of white women to countenance the knowledge and expertise of Black women forced them out. Specifically, the Forten Purvis women resisted white anti-slavery women's need to control, quote, the colored schools that Margaretta Forten and other Black women had founded and administered for over 15 years before the famous Grimke sisters arrived in Philadelphia. As one Philadelphia philanthropist put it to Alexis de Tocqueville, colored children were, quote, legally entitled to public education, but, quote, the white people are imbued with the greatest prejudice against Negroes, and the magistrates don't feel strong enough to enforce the laws favorable to them, end quote. As good anti-slavery reformers, white women in the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society self-righteously committed to visiting the schools for colored children. Yet by demanding complete control over the administration of Black schools, long maintained and administered by Black women, some of whom were in Charlotte Forten Grimke's family, these white anti-slavery women refused to countenance the leadership and community expertise of Black women. This meant forbidding a policy set by Margaretta Forten and Sarah Douglas that allowed students to make up absences due to sickness or inclement weather. This policy existed because poverty and the constant threat of white violence prevented many Black children from attending school on a regular basis, but white anti-slavery women insisted that such policy bred laziness. Worse still, when Sarah and Margaretta hired a student teacher to help monitor student attendance and to aid families whose children never made it to school, the society refused to pay the financial support that the white women initially promised. White anti-slavery women's racial condescension and thorough disrespect for Black women's expertise meant that the Forten Purvis women left the society within a few years of its founding. Worse still, and in a move that signaled white women's hostility toward proudly independent and intellectually sophisticated Black women like Lottie's aunts, members of the society accused their Black colleagues of being, quote, ungrateful and of, quote, refusing the guidance of those who have generations of Christian education on their side, end quote. White anti-slavery women's racial chauvinism in this society signaled to Black abolitionist women like Forten Grimke that the sisterhood proclaimed by white anti-slavery women like Angelina and Sarah Grimke was predicated on Black women's subservience and willingness to ignore the benefits that white women received from the slave system that they claimed to abhor. If we can go to the next slide. There they are. For instance, none of the white women in the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society who criticized Margaretta Forten and Sarah Douglas's school considered inviting Black students to the publicly funded white schools that their own children attended, despite the city's legal guarantee that, quote, colored children had every right to public education. Lottie Forten, raised by these Forten Purvis women after her own mother's death in 1840, was quite literally a product of Black women's recognition that white anti-slavery women were unreliable allies in the fight against slavery, and that Black communities were responsible for, quote unquote, the uplift of the race. Because of the educational infrastructure built and maintained by her Forten Purvis aunts, Lottie learned Shakespeare, mathematics, and philosophy in academically rigorous all-Black private schools administered by Black women, independently of white institutions. In fact, it was not until she moved to Salem to attend Salem Normal School that Charlotte Forten sat in a classroom controlled and administered by white reformers. Because Charlotte Forten's academic training and early intellectual development took place in a predominantly Black world characterized by racial autonomy and Black women's leadership, she was never convinced that white women reformers like the Grimke sisters dictated the terms of either emancipation or women's rights. Although Lottie Forten admired white activists like Lucy Stone and even the Grimke sisters, she was under no illusion that their reform impulse could, quote, deliver the colored people, as she put it, in all the ways that Black communities deserved. This well-warranted distrust of white women allies only deepened as Lottie and her family felt white women's apathy toward the constant anti-Black mob violence that shaped every aspect of free Black existence in the urban North. Throughout the 1830s and 1840s, for instance, mobs of white men burned Black churches and homes, threw bricks at Black children and adults, and generally terrorized any sign of Black autonomous existence in Philadelphia, the city to which the Grimke sisters moved in the 1820s. As the most successful Black sailmaker in the region, James Forten, Charlotte Forten Grimke's grandfather, and his children were often the target of such assault. The Flying Horses riot in 1834, for instance, almost killed his son, Lottie's uncle William, and in 1842, when thousands of white people attacked Black Vigilant Committee members who were celebrating West Indian Emancipation Day, her uncle Robert Purvis was forced to send Lottie's cousins to the family house in Byberry. As an organizer of the celebration and as a vocal supporter of Black voting rights after the state disenfranchised Black men in the 1830s, Robert Purvis was constantly the target of violent white resentment, and he spent the days of musket fire and burning sidewalks sitting in the front hallway of his home, rifle in hand, as hundreds of white people threw bricks, rocks, and torches at his home. This constant orgy of white resentment wore on every member of the Forten Purvis family, who were constantly forced to rebuild after such devastation, and who were never compensated by the city as white anti-slavery leaders were following the mob attack on Pennsylvania Hall in 1838. By the time Lottie moved to Salem then, she understood that white resentment was a feature of white anti-slavery reform. As such, even white allies could not be trusted to champion Black humanity. As her uncle Robert Purvis put it after the 1842 Lombard Street riot forced him to raise his family outside of the city, quote, "Press, church, magistrates, clergymen, and devils are against us. The measure of our sufferings is full. From the most painful and minute investigation in the feelings, views, and acts of this community in regard to us," he concluded, "I am convinced of our utter and complete nothingness in public estimation," end quote. Because Charlotte Forten was raised in a racially autonomous, unapologetically Black-led environment committed to radical abolition and community uplift, and because she understood the racial limitations of white anti-slavery allies, we must take her seriously as an intellectual whose very existence subverted the antebellum confines of race and gender. Her early writings for The Liberator and for the National Anti-Slavery Standard were not mere anti-slavery rhetoric. Rather, she used Black resistance to the federal fugitive slave law as a foil to blind white American patriotism and Anglo-Saxon pride. She might have taught at a white school and sought the paternalistic guidance of white reformers like Thomas Wentworth Higginson and John Greenleaf Whittier. Still, she was not afraid to boldly meditate on the hypocrisy of American reverence for the 4th of July in the aftermath of the Dred Scott decision through her satirical verse parody on Red, White, and Blue. And by the time she published Life on the Sea Islands in the May 1864 edition of the Atlantic Monthly, she was more concerned with the deep humanity of freed people than with white anti-slavery discourse of contemporaries like Harriet Beecher Stowe and Lydia Maria Child. And yet in Charlotte Forten Grimke's time, as in our own, Black women's intellectual praxis is rarely taken seriously for its own genius rooted within its own often radical terms. As a published Atlantic Monthly writer, French translator, experienced teacher, and seasoned political activist, Forten Grimke struggled throughout the 1860s and 1870s to find employment worthy of her academic skill and achievements. When she applied to teach at the prestigious interracial schools founded by anti-slavery writer Diocletian Lewis, Theodore Weld, and the Grimke sisters, she was denied the position because all 4 white activists agreed that white parents would never send their daughters to a school with a Black teacher. Instead, Dia Lewis hired a former slave as a maid in the school to assuage whatever guilt he and the Grimke Wells might have felt over their failure to honor their anti-slavery principles. Even worse was the National Anti-Slavery Standard's response to Lottie's attempts to publish longer essays in the distinguished paper after she struggled to find a suitable job. Although she had known most of the Standard's editors since childhood, and despite the fact that she'd written poetry for the publication for over a decade, the Standard refused her political analysis of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Instead, the Standard published excerpts from Rebecca Harding Davis's 1867 novel, Waiting for the Verdict, an apology for white Southerners' racial violence against the freed people that questioned the entire future of Black equality. With her stifled intellectual ambition and her struggle to make a decent living, it is no wonder that Charlotte Forten married 28-year-old Francis James Grimke in 1878. Although devoted to his wife and determined to provide her with the lifestyle for which her childhood in the antebellum elite prepared her, Frank Grimke discouraged his wife's public intellectualism, and Lottie spent the last 3 decades of her life as a supporter rather than a leader of the Black women's era. You can go to the next slide. What then can we make from her life and her slim yet analytically dense intellectual production? In short, what does Charlotte Forten Grimke's life in but not of the antebellum women's rights movement tell us about the limits of confining Black women to the footnotes of feminist history? Is it enough to ask us to take Black women scholars seriously? to trust that much of the analysis of 19th century white women thinkers should be reconstituted through the lens of Black women's realities of sexual exploitation, discrimination, and enslavement. Unfortunately, I know that this is too much to ask, given our current political moment in which Black women's scholarship is subject to public and private ridicule by those who have no grounding or interest in the Black intellectual tradition. I also know that there are many white women historians, both institutionally affiliated and independent, who so despise my most recent book on the Grimke family that they have accused it of dishonesty. Indeed, the myths of white women's innocence and the conflation of white good intentions with radical racial justice are unyielding realities in our time as they were in Charlotte Fort and Grimke's time. It has been my hope with the Grimkes, the legacy of slavery in an American family, to complicate our notions of white women's supposed anti-slavery egalitarianism as a way to reflect the realities of Black women and their communities' effect on radical racial liberation. Thank you, and I open it for questions.
Bravo, and thank you very, very much. Before and lots of appreciations coming on the chat, so make sure you glimpse that. I have a few minutes now where I have some questions for you, but I want to remind folks who are tuned in, you can drop your questions in the Q&A, and I will do my best to get to as many of them as we can. So anytime, drop them in the Q&A, and we'll be back to that in just a few minutes. You know, I was thrilled that out of this rich, complicated book with so many fascinating characters that today you wanted to draw our attention to Charlotte Fortin Grimke, who I could never call Lottie if I tried. I have just too much esteem for her. And I was thinking as I was listening to you, you know, there's really, you're so right that for me also, rather than a footnote in the long story of women in politics, women in public life, women in the vote in 19th century America, for me, she's always been part of the body of the text because it is an extraordinary life and an extraordinary mind. But I think that you draw our attention not only to her as a whole person, but also to her as part of a family. And I think that's where I'd like to ask you to begin is, you know, not only tell us a little bit about the premise of this book. Why is a family the frame for a book rather than a city, rather than a political movement? There are many ways in which you could have told this story, but you choose to do it through family, Black and white. And what do you think it teaches us? What do we learn about family through here? And I think other folks would like to know more about the family aspect of the story.
Yes, so Charlotte Fortin Grimke, who I talked about, was married to Francis James Grimke. Francis James Grimke and his brother Archibald Grimke were abolitionists, Black abolitionists. After the Civil War, Archibald Grimke became the ambassador to what became the Dominican Republic. Francis Grimke, Black, became pastor of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C., which was the most significant Black civil rights enclave in the Black elite in D.C. from roughly 1870s up through the 1930s and 1940s. The two brothers were the nephews of Sarah and Angelina Grimke. I know the names are confusing and good to put up the images. If you go back one more. Anyway, if you go back one more. But anyway, they were the nephews of Sarah and Angelina Grimke. Sarah and Angelina Grimke were white. They were slaveholders in Charleston, South Carolina. Their father was one of the founders of and leaders of the legal community that became known in Charleston, South Carolina, eventually as the bedrock of the Confederacy. So the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina, had multiple siblings. of all their siblings, they became outspoken anti-slavery activists. And in the 1820s, Sarah and Angelina Grimke left Charleston, moved to Philadelphia, and began to flirt with anti-slavery activism. The white Grimke sisters are famous because, for many reasons, they, in the 1830s, published texts that have become canonical, foundational for articulating the links between the anti-slavery movement and the need for a women's rights movement. They also are famous because Angelina Grimke in the 1830s becomes the first white woman to speak before a legislative body. She talks before the Massachusetts state legislature about the need for women to participate in political representation. As a result of their activism, the Grimke women were maligned and basically forced not to come back to their native Charleston, but they became founders and leaders in anti-slavery reform in the North. Angelina Grimke, the white Angelina Grimke, married Theodore Weld, who was a leading white abolitionist as well. And the two sisters and Theodore Weld eventually moved to rural New Jersey, where they ran a school for the children of the abolitionist and anti-slavery elite. In terms of the popular imagination, the popular discourse, the white Grimke sisters are seen and have been taught as being sort of one of the founders of feminist discourse in the 19th century. The reason why I chose to concentrate on a family aspect is because historians have long known about the white Grimke sisters, right? We have also known that they have these nephews, right? Archibald, Frank, and their other brother, John. And in most of the literature, those two stories are told separately. Or if they're told together, one kind of proceeds and takes precedence, and the other one is put into the background. And so really my interest in the family was, how does this family that is illustrious on all sides are committed in their minds to equality. All of them are on the side of the great movements of the 19th century, whether it's women's rights, anti-slavery, Reconstruction, public education, all of those things. So all of them are doing those things. And yet it's coming from a family that the Black descendants are the product of this very violent relationship by all, recordings between the Grimke sisters' brother Henry and an enslaved woman named Nancy Weston, who the picture went through a few minutes ago. And so I was really concerned not in the fact that the Grimke sisters are quote unquote great, or the brothers are great, or that they've accomplished these things. We know all that, right? That's a given. And yes, those are there. I'm really interested in, how does this family, how did it deal with or not deal with, or what were the consequences of the Black family being born of that moment, of a very, very brutal slave system, in which the white Grimke sisters benefited, and in which the white Grimke sisters often had a hard time dealing with Black people as people and not Black people as cause. And similarly, how did this affect the Black brothers, who became leaders in the Black community and yet also had views of Black people that were problematic? And so where does this come from? How are these people able to be involved in politics and be at the center of all these conversations of the 19th century? All of them are in there. And yet all of them are burdened by the fact that they are the product of, have a hand in the sexual exploitation of Nancy Weston, who is the mother of the Grimke brothers. And the Grimke brother, Archibald, then goes on to have a daughter named Angelina, who becomes a playwright, right? And part of her writings are all about racial trauma, even though, people didn't call it that at the time. So I was really interested. I know it's a long way of answering the question, but I was really interested and am really interested in, what does that mean for this family? And if you read, 19th century Black newspapers from roughly 1840 to the 1920s, the Grimkes are always being talked about, both the Black ones and then with reverence for the white ones, right? But nobody ever talked about them as if they were connected, unless you kind of knew they were connected, right? And then you look at the way they're talking about themselves when they were alive, specifically the Grimke brothers and Charlotte Fortin Grimke, and they never kind of acknowledged this very bulging thing that to me was very apparent, which was slaveholding and the exploitation of Nancy Weston and the fact that these sons were born from that. And so that's really what I was concerned with the book. I think that it speaks to, you know, how is it in many families, American families, in which slavery is kind of the original, you know, stain. How is it that people end up becoming politically, culturally active in whatever they do when this is the seed, right? And what does that end up doing to the effects of their activism? The white Grimke sisters, I will say, and then go on to the next question, were should be lauded for the way that they eloquently spoke about the needs of white women to be involved in anti-slavery, and the fact that they gave a voice to white women who were at their bones believed that slavery was wrong. However, I would argue that they had a hard time shedding off the legacies of being and growing up in a society in which Black people were owned, right? And their inability to treat the Black people in their own family with the type of respect that their rhetoric talked about. And so that's really what I was interested in exploring in this work.
You know, one of the things that this family reminded me of, I don't know if you recall this moment, it's a while back now, but after Barack Obama took the White House, there was a genealogist who unsolicited looked into the president's family history. Yeah. And on the side of President Obama's mother, discovered people who had been enslavers, they had been slaveholders. And I think that this was intended to be a kind of gotcha moment for Barack Obama. But what he said was, well, that's American history, isn't it? And I very much think that it's so apt to think about this as an American family story, both in its literal terms, and of course in its metaphorical terms. And so I think it's such a powerful, as you've said, a kind of reframing. Let me ask you one, if I could, a follow-up question about the white Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina. And really the question is, if you can help us think about how we got it as wrong as we got it. You know, we've been studying these women for a long time. You know, Gerda Lerner publishes a you know, an article about them in the Journal of Negro History of all places. And then her book, it's to say that they have received a great deal of attention from scholars. I think, as you suggest, rightly so. But we missed this part. And I wonder what changed. How did we get here now, or only now, to thinking about this dimension of their families, their lives, their characters, and more?
It's a good question. I think that I'm indebted to scholars of slavery, particularly Black women scholars of slavery, who have done a lot of the legwork of uncovering the relationship between white women who were enslavers in the South and what that actually meant. Great book that came out a few years ago called They Were Her Property by a wonderful historian that sort of dissects the ways in which white women were not kind of passive victims, as we kind of thought of a patriarchy, where they would not have participated in slavery if they had, you know, that's kind of the idea. But that, you know, slavery and enslavement was a cultural, political, and economic system. And so they had interests in that system. And so I really owe it to the fact of the historians catching up to research on slavery and enslavement, and particularly how that relates to and influences relationships between white women enslavers and the enslaved. I would also say that much of Gerda Lerner's book and much of other books that have been written about the Grimkes, it's the way that I saw historians reading the primary sources and missing some of the clues that are pretty blatant. I mean, I say in all my book talks, I'm not kind of uncovering anything that's like hidden. It's more that it's the way people look at the text. For instance, the Gerda Lerner in her book talks a lot about the relationship between the Grimke sisters once they went to Philadelphia and an enslaved man named Stephen. And it's kind of just offhandedly talked about that, oh, isn't it great the Grimke sisters hear about this enslaved man who's back in Charleston. The Grimke sisters talk to their mother who's elderly and doesn't know what to do with this enslaved man. And so the Grimke sisters bring him to New Jersey. There's a time when that interpretation was, oh, this is wonderful, right? Aren't the Grimke sisters bringing an enslaved man to freedom? And yet that is well documented. And yet the letters talking about that man and why it is that he, quote unquote, can't work really delve into the violence that he faced in the Grimke household. And they talk about it, right? And so I think it's a matter of going back over sources. I think it's a matter of not thinking that this stuff is hidden. I mean, sometimes it is, but a lot of time it's a way that you dissect and look at a source, right? My first question when I read that part of Gerda Lerner's book was, well, okay, so they bring this man to New Jersey. Why? Of all the hundreds of slaves that the Grimke family owned, why is this one man seen as so troublesome, quote unquote, over this 3-year period? And number two, what is it? How did he get that way, right? Who is this person? As much as you can find out, right? And so it really is looking at the delving deeper into the sources and not taking what any of them say, Black, white, formerly enslaved, former enslavers, what they say about their participation in the slave system, right? Just as I would argue, future historians can't look back and say, take our word on how we're relating to kind of this political moment, like what we're saying is true versus what we're going to discover is actually true, right? So I think that I hesitate to say that I'm somehow uncovering something that has never been uncovered before. I think it's a matter of looking at the sources and also looking at a variety of sources. I said in my talk, what part of the point of the talk is that taking Black voices seriously. And if you take Black voices seriously, Black people were talking about the violence of the Grimkes all the time, right? It wasn't a secret that the Grimke family were particularly known for being brutal slaveholders in Charleston, right? So that was not something that was a secret. If you were to look at Black sources and the free Black community and how they were talking about this. So I would really argue that that's another thing, right? And not assuming that because Black people were enslaved, that somehow their voices are completely lost. Yes, we have a whole argument with the archive and all that type of stuff, but there are ways to uncover Black voices, particularly in a city like Charleston, where you had a free Black community, right, that was related to the Grimke brothers, right, and that talked about them all the time, right? And so part of uncovering that story was not just relying on what the Grimke sisters are saying, not just relying on what the brothers are saying, but what are the Black people, as much as we can discern, saying about the fact that there's a white man, Henry Grimke, he takes this woman, Nancy Weston, he has 3 sons with her, and then they grow up and become these leaders, after the Civil War.
Shout out to Stephanie Jones Rogers.
Stephanie Jones Rogers, yes.
Yeah, and her remarkable book that really does illuminate and center women as slaveholders and the violence that accompanies that. And yet, I think the thing I want to draw our attention to is in a story that is importantly centered in part in a city like Philadelphia. This isn't only a story about slavery and unfreedom. it's also a story about a remarkable place with a long-standing, robust, distinguished community of Black Americans who are not enslaved, some of whom, like Charlotte Fortin, are generations from having been enslaved. And here, I think I wanted to ask you to help us appreciate how you see this as a story, if I could distinguish between slavery and racism. I think that's the distinction I want us to try and sit with for a moment. And I think, it's, you know, situating it in Philadelphia, I think helps us see that while those two might be companions, they aren't necessary companions in this story.
Excellent, good question. So I would say that, you know, the Philadelphia that Charlotte Fortin grew up in, and the Philadelphia that the Black Grimke brothers came to when they make their way to Lincoln University in Western Pennsylvania, was a city that had this very old, robust, politically active Black community. That community founds the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the leading sort of Black denomination in the country. That community is one of the first to found schools, and that community is one of the first to really argue against gradual emancipation, which was in Pennsylvania, New York, other states, that, you know, slavery would gradually end in those states, you know, post 1821, and that there was still sort of this idea in the early 19th century, could Black people be part of kind of this republic? And so that community in itself was sort of a fascinating to read about, and looking at through all the wonderful work that's been done, sort of social history of antebellum Philadelphia. But Philadelphia was also a city that politically had ties very directly to the slaveholding South, and that also had many people who were slaveholders who lived in Philadelphia, and their families still owned enslaved people in the South. So that's the Grimke sisters. When they went to Philadelphia, part of it was because, you know, it was the Quakerism and the Anti-Slavery Society. Part of it was because they had an older sister who lived there, who had married, and she was part of this community of slaveholding white people who still owned slaves in the South, right? But they lived in Philadelphia, right? So it gives us an idea of like the scope of the economy, slave economy. And so that, and the history of enslavement in Pennsylvania meant that the city itself, like much of the North, had a distaste for slavery as an institution, and distaste for slavery as the years went on because of its contradictions with kind of the idea of a republic. And yet did not necessarily think that Black people were even capable of being part of the body politic. Did not believe, you know, that Black people even had a future, you know, as the country went forward. And really didn't have a plan for when slavery actually ended, in terms of consulting with that community about what the needs, desires, and deserves were, right? And so I really wanted to, I think the Grimkes kind of offer a way of looking at that tension, right? Not just between people who disagree with slavery and people who wanted slavery, but between people who did believe slavery was wrong, right? There's no saying that they didn't, right? But they have a very, very different notion of what about Black people? What about racial equality? Does racial equality just mean that you argue for freedom in the South and schools for Black children in Philadelphia? Or does it mean that, you know, you live your life in terms of ensuring that Black communities are at the table and at the center, and centering them in terms of how you look at relief and anti-slavery and provisions for that community? And so I think that's a very pertinent question now. I was writing this obviously during, you know, 2019, 2020, and seeing those conversations arising of what does it mean to be allied, right? What does it mean to, you know, that for a long time in this country, we kind of look at and think the horrible South, quote unquote, racism in the South is bad, although that area of the country is horrible. We're sort of in this liberal enclave, quote unquote. And yet that's the very same ideas that, the Grimkes had when they were in Philadelphia. Isn't Philadelphia a wonderful place? And yes, it didn't have slavery in the same way that Charleston had slavery. And yet there's still this nagging inability to see Black people as people who deserve the same rights, equalities, imperfections, economic opportunities as everybody else.
I appreciate you letting us glimpse in that answer that you do write this book in a very particular moment in our own time, right? And I think folks will discern, I think, the presence of the present in the best sense in this book. So as we do always in these bookworms, we urge you to get your own copy and take that kind of journey with Dr. Greenidge also. All right, I'm going to take one more quick question, and then I'm going to, Anne is going to come back in. So, there are moments in which this book is really cinematic, I think. And I just really, it made me think about HBO's The Gilded Age, and the way in which in that series we are being introduced to so-called middle class, so-called elite Black Americans in Brooklyn at the turn of the 20th century. I don't know. So who's going to play Charlotte Fortin Grimke for you? And then I'm going to turn it over to Anne. It's just a throwaway question. But, I think there's a film in the future.
I think there's a film too. I mean, Kerry Washington is, I don't know, someone, I don't know. I often think of that, of who would play them. I think that they would have to be somebody, good enough actors to get kind of the nuance of them, because they're endlessly fascinating. The Grimkes, they're a fascinating bunch. Thank you so much.
Welcome back, Anne. Thanks. I mean, Angela, sorry.
Oh my gosh, thank you both so much. And I know we'll take questions from the audience in a couple of moments. So if anybody else wants to add anything to the Q&A, really quickly though, I just want to do a couple of housekeeping things. Our latest exhibit opened in December, and it's The Art of Resistance in Early America. You can come view the exhibit in person at the Clements Library from noon to 4, Monday through Friday. We also have it available online. And if you haven't visited the Clements before and would also like a behind the scenes tour while visiting the exhibit, we have opportunities for that as well, and we'll paste those in the chat. Next month, we'll be welcoming Jill Newmark to the program to discuss her book as part of Black History Month, Without Concealment, Without Compromise, The Courageous Lives of Black Civil War Surgeons. And Cheney Chopre will also be joining us from the staff, curator of manuscripts, for that conversation. As people who have signed up for the Bookworm, you'll receive a reminder for each of the programs, and then you can choose whether to join us live once again or to wait until the email comes out on Friday afternoon, which will have the link to the recording. So later today, you will receive a link to the recording and resources mentioned in today's broadcast, and you're welcome to pass that on to other people and tell them about this wonderful program. And I'll just mention once again that Cinda Sue Davis was the sponsor of today's Bookworm, and we really appreciate that. And we appreciate all of the support that you give us by participating in the program, in these programs and other endeavors of the Clements Library. And as always, of course, welcome your financial contributions as well. So I will stop sharing and turn it back over to Martha, who surely has had a chance to read over the Q&A. And thank you.
I have. Thanks again, Angela. And I just want to echo encouraging everyone to support these bookworms and the library generally. People have a lot of questions about Charlotte Grimke. I know you're not surprised, but some of them center on her marriage and her relationship to Francis Grimke. I think sometimes still we can be surprised to encounter a heterosexual couple in 19th century America that manages to some degree, an important degree, to accommodate and even encourage a woman's public life. But as one of our questioners, Mariah Seisberg, suggests, that's not always easy. That there's a real risk for Charlotte Fortin Grimke in her public writing in the Atlantic, for example. So can you talk a little bit about the risks that she faced and how does that work in a marriage like hers to a man who becomes the Reverend Francis Grimke?
Excellent question, and thank you for it. Charlotte Fortin married Frank Grimke when he was sort of on the up and up in his career. So the brothers emerged from Charleston. You'll read it in the book. They end up going to Lincoln University, eventually meeting for the first time their white aunts who agreed to pay for their studies at Lincoln. And Frank ended up going to Princeton Theological Seminary. Archie ended up going to Harvard Law School through the support of the Grimke sisters. Frank, as a student who was supporting himself at Princeton, and in the book I go into why he chose to do that and not accept the financial help. He ended up being in a world at Princeton with the few Black students there where I would argue for the first time he's encountering the fact that he is of a different class. So they're all Black, they're all at Princeton, they're all, all four of them. And yet the other Black students there have family who can help support them in whatever little way that they can. Whereas the Grimke brothers, literally they're coming from enslavement to Princeton, right? There's nothing more, dramatic than that. And so by the time he met his wife, after going to Princeton and arriving in DC, and they had met each other there's evidence they met each other briefly beforehand. She was really the center of this very elite class of Black people in DC, right? She's a Fortin, so that name still meant a lot. She has all of these cousins who work in either the Reconstruction governments in the South or they have appointments in the federal government in DC. And so for Frank Grimke, this woman is not just someone he's attracted to and likes and love, and that's all evident in their writings back and forth, but she's also, somebody who's going to give him legitimacy in this community because he's considered, he's somebody who's coming in from the outside as an enslaved person. I think it's hard for us to realize and account for these kind of class differences within the postbellum Black community. But there is. And so when they get married, there really is a real love there and a real admiration. And their mother, the Grimke brothers' mother, Nancy Weston, moves into the house that Charlotte Fortin and Frank Fortin live in. They help raise Archie's daughter, Angelina, who we haven't even gotten to, when she's a child. And so their house is really a center for the family. Frank's admiration in terms of his letters for his wife are great. And he really is attracted to the fact that she's smart and she reads and she's very intellectually sophisticated in terms of her analysis of politics and what does it mean to vote versus not vote and districting and all. I mean, the letters are fascinating. But he is a minister in the Presbyterian Church, and he had certain views on how that church should function in a city like DC that was in the midst of Reconstruction and backlash, and should Congress or should local people fund the Black schools and all of this scrutiny. And so Frank's first instinct was to buckle down and make that institution as exclusive as possible, in a way, in his mind, to prop up the Black community without any kind of criticism. right? So that we would have a Black church, you would have Black senators, and Duke Ellington's family, for instance, worships there. It's the elite of Black community. And so he's focused on that. And so in their letters to one another, he never says to Charlotte Forten, oh, you cannot, I forbid you from being involved in public life, right? And she is involved in public life. She hosts the National Association of Colored Women, and she hosts fundraisers for the Black schools, but she definitely takes more of a back seat than she had previously. And my argument is that that really comes from a place of the class of Black people that they were in DC at that specific time. They talk about the ambivalence of being married to a Black woman who was very public, right? That was seen as something that was not desirable if you were a Black man in DC at this very specific moment trying to make your mark. It changes over time, but in the very specific moment they get married. And also, they have a child. The child unfortunately died at 9 months old. And after that, Charlotte Forten suffered from all of these health conditions and health problems. So she continued to be involved in civic culture and civil rights, and she's very good friends with Anna Julia Cooper and Mary Church Terrell, and she's sort of in the mix of those things. And yet it becomes much less public and much more a private thing. And Frank talks about how that's what he prefers, right? Because if he's going to build this church, it has to be beyond white reproach, is the word he uses.
Mm. Yeah. So Rex Hauser has a couple of questions that let us think about I guess the legacy of Charlotte Forten. He asks, for example, or they ask, for example, were radical womanist writers of the 70s influenced by Charlotte Forten Grimke, for example? And I guess related to that is a question about her memory. How is the memory of her sustained? I know, for example, her diaries, which are so fascinating, have gone in and out of print over the years. It's not so easy always, I think, to capture her story. So who remembers her and why, I guess, before you, of course.
Very good question. So I think she's been remembered and talked about, by Black feminist women historians, Carla Peterson, you mentioned her in your work. People, sort of Black women who study Black feminist histories remember her and talk about her. I think her diaries were restored by Ray Billingsley. I believe he was one of the first ones to put them like in a book form that you could purchase in the 70s. And that was sort of a result of the civil rights movement and Black studies and those things. I think that she definitely had an influence on how Black women or remnants of how Black women approach and are involved in the public sphere of intellectualism, right? And how it is that they engage with that. So Charlotte Forten was not somebody who was like uncomfortable talking, the 14th Amendment with Charles Sumner, right? She had grown up doing that, right? And so she was it wasn't as if she felt like as an imposter or any of those things. It was like, this was what she did. She was an intellectual. She thought about these things. She read them. She analyzed them. And so I definitely think that has a legacy amongst Black thinkers in the 20th century of being involved in the thinking without making apology for that being the case, right? And writing her writings for the Atlantic Monthly, Life on the Sea Islands, still remain some of the best writings about what the Sea Islands look like right as the Civil War is ending, right? For those of you who are interested, and the way she's describing and gives humanity, I argue, to the Black people, as somebody who was not from the South, right? And is talking about the desire of Black people to learn and be educated. And, so I think that she's somebody who definitely, the way she approached intellectual engagement, I think has its legacies. And I definitely think her lack of fear in taking to task many of the white anti-slavery people she worked with and knew and was friends with for their reactions to and relationships to Black people.
couple of questions about, I think, the way identity works in this story. Thomas Wagner asks, were females of mixed race included within the community of the Black liberation movement of your period? Miriam Khan asks, or comments, mixed interracial families aren't unique. How are the Grimkés similar and different from other mixed and prominent families? And and my question out of those really is, are those the right categories? Are the Grimkés thought of as what in our parlance today would be mixed race or interracial? What is the color line like, and where do they sit in the 19th and early 20th century, which is a time, I think, very different than our own, maybe where terms like mixed race and interracial families almost didn't exist, I suspect.
Yeah. Excellent. Very good question. And thanks for saying that. I mean, those terms are really recent incarceration. So one of the things I make and put in the book is that the fact of Black people who are of African American and Native American descent and white or European descent, that has always been, right? Often not sort of from a willing relationship, right? So the exploitation of enslaved women underneath slavery is, very well documented. All wonderful literature that's been done on that. Tavolia Glimp is one, for instance. So that reality that the people who are emancipated in 1865, that a good proportion of those people are the children of enslavers and the children of enslaved. That's just the American reality. Were those people necessarily thought of in the mid-19th century terms as being like mixed race? Well, yes, that's a category that exists somewhere, but not everywhere. And it really depended on the context, right? If you were a Black person like Archibald Grimke in Charleston, and then you went to Boston, you had a very different kind of racialization than you had in Charleston, right? And so I think one of the things I was fascinated with and continue to be fascinated with is racial categories, the very contingent on space and time. This family was not unique, right? The fact of families of white people and Black people and all different racial people sort of combining together is not unique. Really what I wanted to do was explore, well, what does that mean that we know that this is not unique, right? What if we just take that as a given, which is, and one of the fascinating things about the Black elite at that time is that class took this as a given, right? They take it as a given that, some of them, or a good proportion of them, are elite because they are descendants of an enslaver and an enslaved. They know this, right? It's not as if this is a surprise. And so really leaning into the fact that at the time, those categories are very different. And the Grimkes, both the Black and white Grimkes, are responding to racialization based on that moment, right? They're not based in 2024. They're not even based in, 1920s and 1930s, when there's a whole different way that people are talking about these things. They're relating to it from the legacy of enslavement. And so really leaning into that. So mixed race people have always existed. I think the other thing, as I was writing the book, I was struck by the ways in which, and some of you might remember this, people were talking about how our racial moment could be fixed if we just had like more interracial marriages. And wasn't it a sign that the country is headed in the right direction because there's more interracial marriages? And there was all this stuff, like 2020, 2021 was this, all these popular pieces. And it was just amazing for me because older people in my family, Black women, were like, well, that's always happened, right? It's not as if this is a new thing. It means maybe the categories have changed and maybe marriage now is different, but this is not something that is new. And so really writing the book, leaning into the fact that, well, what does that actually mean in their time, right? They were not unique, and they didn't think they were unique. They did think they were unique because they were Grimkes. That was a whole other thing. But they, in terms of their racial makeup, they were not, and would not have argued that they were somehow unique.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating chapter, if you will, in a longer story. a story in which both the meaning and the explanation for what that means. I mean, I think they are still in a world that in which scientific racism promotes the idea of what was called mulatto degeneracy, right?
exactly.
That mixed race people were certainly biologically and by consequence psychologically and socially inferior and even destined to a kind of extinction. I think this is still an open question, and so to imagine them navigating that world, right, with all the distinctions that they earn, at the same time there being these fundamental questions about their soundness as humans. It's really really remarkable, and it brings, for me, it just brings into relief more starkly what a remarkable story this is.
Yeah.
I know that we have kept you a bit over time, and but I know folks appreciate you staying with us and letting us get to most, though not all of the questions today. But I thank everybody who joined us, and everybody who's brought some really important and provocative questions to the table. Please, friends, get your own copy of the Grimkés. Follow Kerri Greenidge. We're not going to put her on the spot today to ask her what she's doing next, but we know there's a next in the works, and we look forward to that very much. And thank you again to Angela, to Anne, to Helen, to everybody at the Clements Library. Stay tuned for the next Bookworm. Visit us at the library. And there's Angela, who I think is going to just take us out. But thank you again, Dr. Greenidge, for a really fantastic conversation. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. And I mean, at the Clements Library, you know, wonderful, wonderful, invested in it, supported it. It's, you know, marvelous collection. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thanks so much for being here and for taking, you know, a nice deep dive, and I'm sure that everyone will enjoy the book. And thank you so much, Martha, for leading the rest of the conversation. And I appreciate you both so much, and everybody who signed on as well. So have a great weekend, everyone.